Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, we welcome back Ryne Stanek to the Mets as they continue to bolster their bullpen. We also break down talks reopening between the Mets and Pete Alonso. Is this saga finally nearing an end? As always, we close out the show answering your mailbag questions. So subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today and subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. If you'd like to drop us a review, we really appreciate that. Leave a mailbag question with that review. You can watch us on YouTube and ask questions in the comments under the show there as well. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. A huge thanks to everyone that came out to see the Mets Pod during an amazing day at Citi Field. We had a great time. It was awesome. The crowd really filled out. The questions were phenomenal. The audience was really, really great. Such a loyal audience we have with the Mets Pod. And we will be revealing the winner of our Cadillac Club ticket giveaway at the end of this show. That's right. 2 tickets to the Cadillac Club, plus a parking pass for the Mets game on Thursday, April 17th versus the Cardinals to our lucky winner. And one more piece of business. For anyone planning a trip to spring training for the first exhibition game on Saturday, that's February 22nd, we'll be there. More details to come soon. Joe, I had a lot to get through. How are you, man?
I'm doing good. Life is pretty normal for me. You're down in Mobile, Alabama for the Senior Bowl. How are things with you, Connor? That's one thing I always say. You always ask me how I'm doing. I say I'm good, and we just move on with the show. I never reciprocate. So how are you, my friend?
I appreciate that. Listen, a lot of moving and shaking right now. Everything's good down here. You know the rules of this show. We don't really miss episodes of the Mets Pod. Whether I'm traveling for work, you got stuff going on, we got things going on. There's always notable Mets stuff to talk about, and we find a way to get it done. And I'm really happy to be here, Joe, because one of my favorite random Mets is back with the team in Ryne Stanek. We'll get to that in just a moment. But I think as we often have to do this offseason, we have to open the show talking about Pete Alonso, or in Steve Cohen's words, or somewhat words, the exhaustion of these negotiations. We're right there with Steve Cohen. These are tiring. Feels tedious at this point. But, Joe, it does feel like what had completely closed or felt like it was time for everybody to move on has somehow reopened in this never-ending contract negotiation saga between Pete Alonso and the Mets.
I have been going back and forth since Saturday at Amazing Day when we were just hanging out in the Piazza Club and, just mere feet away from us, Steve Cohen, David Stearns, and Carlos Mendoza were talking to Gary Cohen. And I hear Steve Cohen start talking about the Alonso thing. I hear all the chants from the fans saying, "We want Pete," and everything from the crowd. And I hear Steve Cohen going on this kind of diatribe of how exhausting and difficult this negotiation has been. And I'll tell you, right after he finished, I said in my own brain, Pete's gone. And you and I have been kind of in lockstep on this show that it's a annoying process of sorts, but it'll work out in the Mets' favor in the end. In that moment in time, I gave up hope. And now there's some reporting from John Heyman and then as well as Andy Martino today for SNY.TV that talks have kind of reopened a little bit recently. And when I look at that, and I look at this whole situation, they have the general basis of a contract structure in place. 3 years, opt-outs. Now, the structure within the confines of that, whether that's buyouts on the opt-outs or deferred money or all those things that are kind of being considered, let's just sit down at a table and figure this thing out. Let's, in my opinion, scrap the buyouts, because that was one thing that I looked into. So from Boris and Pete's camp, I believe Evan Roberts said this on his Rico Bronya podcast, that he had heard that one of the things that Boris and Alonso's camp wanted was, he called them bonuses, but I assume he meant buyouts associated with the opt-outs. And if you're going to use that as like a standard, the only times that I could find that opt-outs had buyouts associated, ironically, were Cody Bellinger and Matt Chapman last offseason for Scott Boras. So if Boras is calling that the industry standard, I think he's just saying, I got a couple of teams to do it, so you should too.
I'm with you, Joe. I mean, we just keep doing the same thing over and over again, which is every time you feel like both sides have moved on, you try to apply some logic here and realize that one, this is on a shorter term deal, probably the best available destination for Pete. And for the Mets, they still have a need for power at first base in this lineup with a market that's evaporated. And the fact is, though, and Andy hinted at this on SNY, that it's kind of hard to picture a team like the Blue Jays, and he didn't even phrase it like that. It was more so unlikely that they're going to top the 3-year, $70-ish million deal that the Mets had put on the table at one point. So it all comes down to Pete can wait and wait and wait, but why should anyone believe that something is going to change, right? When you talk about something like this in football terms, usually waiting for an injury. That's not as frequent or common practice in baseball, that you're sitting there and going into your camp and saying, well, people get hurt every year, whether it's torn ACLs and on and on and on, and then all of a sudden Pete Alonso becomes magically more valuable. It doesn't work like that in baseball. So I don't really see his market drastically changing. The market has just kind of dictated and told him what they think of him. And this might sound crazy to some people listening, but you could argue the Mets are being generous with how they're looking at this right now, because I haven't ever seen a reported or rumored contract structure from another team. So we're not even sitting here and going, well, he's got a 3-year from another team out there without defer. We don't know any of that. All we get is the 3-year, $70-ish million from the Mets, where the Mets might be doing that because, one, it's Pete Alonso, and there is something to a homegrown talent. And two, because they're comfortable with that situation where teams, Pete's still an external free agent to other teams. External free agents are a higher risk. You haven't had that guy in your building. You don't know what his day-to-day is like. You don't know how he takes care of himself or how he goes about his business. So the Mets are at a place of comfort on a 3-year deal. It's pretty decent money that we just haven't seen another team be willing to do that yet, Joe. And at some point, whether Pete's getting bad advice or expecting something different, I think there's a little bit of a reality check in order here that's a good deal on the table from the Mets.
And the 70-ish million figure, Andy had reported on SNY as well, that's like the present day value. So if this deal got announced, it would be, I don't know what the number is, something higher, but it would say 3 years, 85 million with deferred money. That takes the present day value down to 68 to 70. So I believe the Mets have been plenty generous in a market that, as you said, Connor, we don't know exists. We've heard the Toronto Blue Jays stuff. We've heard some Los Angeles Angels. I mean, is Pete Alonso really going to take a short-term deal to go play for the Angels? Is that the best course of action as he looks to rebuild his value, which is the whole premise of taking the 3-year deal with opt-outs? Is the idea is I'm going to be really good and opt out, and then I will get that long-term deal that I coveted. So it makes all the sense in the world for these two parties to come together, and it seems like it's just a lot of crazy. It's now getting crazy up and down. At first, it was just the Mets are looking at this, or Alonso's looking at this. Now it's just there's almost fighting words out there from Boras and Cohen, and it's getting pretty heated. But it still feels like this is something that has to come together.
So I give Steve Cohen a lot of credit for his answer at Amazing Day because, one, it was transparency and honesty from an owner in sports, which is not always the case across sports. Two, Cohen has really let David Stearns do his job throughout this despite the fan pressure. And three, the most important part to me, this was a big leverage play because the Boras camp cannot afford to lose the Mets' interest in this. Because if the Mets publicly pull out from having interest in bringing back Pete, there's a world where Pete Alonso is talking about a qualifying-esque offer from a bad organization like the Angels, like you just said, Joe. If there's no Mets out there, why would any other team be giving him 2 to 3 years of top first
Right.
baseman money?
Yeah.
You have to have the Mets in this. So credit to Steve Cohen for having a backbone at a fan festival with all the. We were 10 feet away from people chanting to bring
Yeah.
back Pete Alonso. And Cohen, who obviously is a guy that is not afraid of some really tough negotiations and tough business conversations from his history in not obviously just owning a baseball team, but finance. I thought it showed that there's a backbone to the Mets organization, that they won't be bullied by an agent that they've been really good to, by the way,
Yeah.
over the years. So I really respect that kind of delivery from Cohen.
Me too. And he turned the boos for David Stearns, which if you boo David Stearns, absolutely shame on you.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, crazy to be booing David Stearns after he took a team, made a team that made it to the National League Championship Series just a few months ago. But he turned those boos into cheers because at the end of the day, I think at its core, Mets fans just wanted an explanation for what is going on, because it's a lot of mystery. Everyone listening to the show, you listen to us every week, hopefully, and it is a lot of speculation. So to actually have the owner of the team give a upfront answer, just a real genuine answer to the question of what's going on with Pete Alonso, I think there was some appreciation in the crowd. And that's why when he finished everything he said, there was applause.
A great call. And fans love that. They love honesty from an owner that, he's earned the benefit of the doubt because he spends
Yeah.
big money. He spent money on the right people to work in the organization. And that, there was just once again transparency with these negotiations that the fans, when they hear those things, go, oh, like the Mets
Yeah. Oh,
can't
that
make
makes
Pete
sense.
Alonso
Yeah.
sign. They
Right.
can't, people forget that. And that was a really big argument throughout the pre-free agency Pete Alonso conversation, is that especially before Joel Sherman had reported the 6-year offer that Pete had passed up on, fans were like, why isn't this done? Extend Pete, extend Pete. And I think Cohen has finally taken the approach of like, hey, it takes two to make a deal. We can't do everything for the deal. He's got to be realistic where the deal is. So, Joe, I have no idea where this thing is going to go before our next show.
No idea. My best guess is we'll be having a conversation much like this again next week. I don't think this is coming to a head soon, but hey, I will be more than happy to be hopping on an emergency podcast this weekend or sometime soon with you wherever you are.
That's I will be in New Orleans if it's next week. So we'll see where that goes. I will happily do a Pete emergency podcast from the French Quarter or wherever it may be. But listen, so we will continue to be all over the Pete Alonso situation. Some good news here: a guy that is signed and ready to play and return to the Mets, a favorite of the show, and Ryne Stanek. He's back on a 1-year deal. This is a name we've talked a lot about, Joe, because a year ago the Mets had interest in Stanek. They end up acquiring him at the deadline, and Stanek was a guy that I think had a tough acclimation period to the Mets in the regular season. And then, like he always does, the guy was absolute nails in the postseason. I mean, you just look at his postseason track record, he's typically lights out. And I mean, Stanek in 17 games with the Mets during the regular season had an ERA over 6. But when you show up when it matters most, Joe, that's what people remember. And Stanek was a guy that was lights out against the Brewers. He was really good against the Phillies, and he was just solid against the Dodgers. And this is somebody that was phenomenal all those years in Houston. This is a move I really like, Joe, because it feels like this is the kind of arm that is available at every deadline for teams going for it. And the fact he's only going to cost you on a 1-year deal, bring him in now, get him back in the fold. This is somebody that I think will really, really feed off of pitching in New York again. And the acclimation period now is different.
Connor, this was one of your New Year's resolutions, right? For the Mets is
Right.
fill these little holes now, so that way. Granted, it's not like they had to give up a massive prospect to obtain Ryne Stanek, but you could keep any of the prospects in the case of this. But 1 year, I believe it's $4.5 million with $500,000
That's the rumor,
incentives.
yeah.
Yeah, so
That's from Mark
Perfectly
Feinsand.
from
Yep.
Mark Feinsand, yeah. So that's perfectly fine value. As you said, Ryne Stanek was huge for the Mets in the playoffs, and frankly, they don't get to the NLCS without him. What relievers could you have counted on in the playoffs? You had Edwin Diaz, who had his ups and downs, of course, but Phil Maton didn't have a good postseason. Beyond that, like Reed Garrett had his ups and downs. Jose Buto kind of struggled a little bit during the postseason. Daniel Nunez was injured. So having Stanek back, I think just solidifies this bullpen. And when you look at kind of the lock spots, you have Edwin Diaz, you have AJ Minter, Ryne Stanek, Reed Garrett, Jose Buto, which someone reminded me at Amazing Day when we talked about the bullpen. I failed to mention Buto, so this is for you. Buto, important part of the bullpen.
Yeah.
And as I said, Daniel Nunez is a guy that is healthy heading into spring training, and that's big for the Mets. And beyond that, there's some bullpen depth now, which is something you're going to need to get through the 162. Huascar Brazoban, who the Mets got at the trade deadline, is now depth. Sean Reed-Foley, Danny Young, Max Kranick, Tyler Zuber. Like I'm just scrolling the 40-man roster so people know. The bullpen right now is in a state where I think it's really, really good right now, and it also has depth to make it through the long marathon that is a baseball season.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those situations where you look up after adding Minter and Stanek and you go, oh, now this is what we wanted it to be. Because now you're not elevating guys into roles that are far above what their expectations are. Maybe it takes a little bit of pressure off Buto, who really wore down at the end of the year. Maybe there is still one depth signing out there, or more importantly, one of the guys that goes to spring training competing ends up taking over one of those depth spots, Joe. And the fact is, now, if you can get something out of Nunez like you did in the middle of last year, or Brazoban bounces back to the player he was for the Marlins before he came to the Mets, I mean, that's a pretty well-rounded group, especially the fact that Minter's your lefty being the bridge to Diaz.
And it's very solidified, Connor, where these are, it's not like there's three good relievers and then you have, 7 guys competing for 3 more spots or whatever. Like, I could genuinely feel really good about 6 guys, I think, in this bullpen. And I think that puts the Mets in just a really good spot to get the season started. And as David Stearns has said multiple times before, the bullpen you see on opening day, it's not the bullpen you'll see on Memorial Day. It's not the bullpen you'll see on July 4th. It's not the bullpen you'll see on September 1st. So this is an ever-evolving thing, but I believe the Mets are setting themselves up to have a strong starting point, which I think was important. And going back to your resolution, I think they did a good job of fulfilling at least the bullpen portion of that.
Yeah, it's now it has an infrastructure in place that, you're not shutting anything down at adding at the deadline, but you don't feel like you need to. I remember every podcast we did that time last year where we were like, how do you build a bullpen in July? Like, how do you do it? And credit to Stearns, he found some creative ways to make it good enough that the Mets were a couple wins away from a World Series, but you're really giving yourself a better chance at success later by doing that business now.
No question. No question. So, yeah, all in all, I will say good move. I'm a Ryne Stanek guy. I campaigned for him to be a Met last winter, and it didn't happen. So very happy to see that they were able to bring him back after he played such a pivotal role in them making it as far as they did in the playoffs.
All right, one more familiar face I want to bring up here, Joe, because we've talked about Pete Alonso, who's not officially back. We talked about Stanek, who is. Jose Iglesias, still out there. I guess not a robust market for the pop star that is Candelita after such a incredible year with the Mets last year. I've really tried to wrap my brain around this a couple different ways, Joe. I think I've landed on the Mets would like to get to spring training and see what they have in their young guys before they just have Iglesias, fill a decent amount of at-bats this year and obviously a utility role. But you made a really good point to me before that, you also need to be careful where you're not forced to have Acuna be a utility guy because you want Acuna at his age to be playing consistently and developing. Do you think there's a world where, Iglesias, who it's pretty clear, I think he'd love to be back. He's such a good fit here that the Mets go, you know what, let's bring Iglesias back in? Or is it one of those situations where it's like, hey, we have to leave spots open for other players or else we're just never going to find anything out about them?
It's, I think, a mix of the two. Like, I wouldn't be surprised that if we got a tweet in 2 hours, Mets and Jose Iglesias have agreed to a 1-year deal and he's back. But David Stearns, and I always remember certain things that he says consistently. And one thing he always consistently says is, no matter what our payroll is, no matter what the team situation is, we always have to leave room and opportunity for young players to get opportunity. And me personally, my general belief is I don't want young players that I think have potential to be everyday type of players kind of just hanging out on the bench and playing periodically. So for me, I would try to bring Jose Iglesias back. And I know that in a way halts like a potential opportunity for Acuna on the opening day roster, but he's going to find his way here one way or another if he goes to AAA and does what he's supposed to. And I think it's more important for his development to get those consistent at bats, especially given how inconsistent he was at the AAA level last year. So for me, I bringing Jose Iglesias back makes a lot of sense and would really, take make the bench a strength because, as much as Francisco Lindor has played every game, his back has now started to flare up. I would be a little cautious on trying to play Francisco Lindor 162 games again. Brandon Nimmo, I know he's an outfielder, so it's a little different, but coming off the plantar fasciitis, that's another guy plays all the time. Pete Alonso, is he back? Is he not back? Because that's a guy that played 162 games. So you need that depth on the bench as well. And I think Iglesias is the perfect fit on the bench as just a contact-oriented guy that can play defense all throughout the infield.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's a really good point that sometimes, and I'm guilty of this, you look at younger players that are going to get a chance at filling a role, and I think internally you always project the best outcome.
Right.
And naturally, that's what you want. And I think Iglesias gives you a floor at a key bench spot that, they'll know quickly, but it gives you a more of a comfort feeling by bringing back Iglesias. And that's honestly kind of the same argument in a way for Stanek. I think Stanek has such a great postseason resume that played into it as well. But I think there's something there where it's like, yeah, we have all these arms. David Stern signs a different arm, it feels like, every other day, and we're going to get to Port St. Lucie and see what they have. But we know what a Ryne Stanek is. Even at age 33, I know exactly what I'm getting from Ryne Stanek. So it is trying to establish a floor at as many spots on a Major League Baseball roster that you possibly can.
The thumbs up thing. If you're watching on YouTube, you might have just seen a thumbs up next to Connor's face. That was great.
I don't even know how it did that.
I don't know, but very funny nonetheless. I would say as you mentioned, with the young players, the prospects, we often I often present what the best case scenario is for some of these young players. It's certainly a possible outcome that Luis Angel Acuna is a utility guy at the next level. I'm not ruling out that possibility.
Not everyone's an everyday player.
But with a team that is built to win right now, they just signed Juan Soto for $765 million. I think it makes sense to just solidify all those little spots now. And as the season progresses, there's injuries, there's underperformance, things happen. Like Luis Angel Acuna is going to play a role regardless.
All right, you're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. Let's go down on the farm, and we got a down on the farm mailbag question from Evan Schwartz, 2293. This is on YouTube. Thank you, Evan. How likely is it that Elian Pena, who is the Mets international signing, massive signing bonus, really big deal in this class, for those of anyone that's missed it, Elian Pena, the Mets' big ad from the international signing period. So the question was, how likely is it that Pena stays at shortstop throughout the minors? Also, who would be the shortstop prospect most likely to move elsewhere, Joe, if it's not Pena?
All right, so what I love about this is Elian Pena is just recently turned 17 years old. He has yet to take one professional plate appearance or one inning in the field, and we are already getting questions and wondering about his long-term defensive home. So I love everything about this question. With that said, most scouts that I talk to think as he physically matures, the most likely home for him is third base.
That was
But
Mauricio.
yeah, right. He's not quite built the same Mauricio. I mean, Mauricio, which by the way, very funny. I noticed this just the other day when I was looking at the roster. They should update Mauricio's height and weight because they still have his height and weight from when he signed when he was like 17. They list him at 6'4", 166. He's probably like
Yep.
he's probably 210 now. So
He
let's
filled
get
out.
yeah, let's get on that. But I think ultimately Pena is a guy that most scouts believe third base is his long-term home, but he's a young enough guy. You develop as a shortstop because that is his comfort spot. And as he progresses through the minors, you kind of make the adjustment when you have to make the adjustment. As far as other shortstop prospects, Luis Angel Acuna is a shortstop prospect that I think is more of a second baseman at the next level. Jet Williams, the Mets #1 prospect, he could play any of the three spots up the middle, short, second, or center. I think center field might be Jet Williams' best position, but ultimately they have a guy making a lot of money that should have some all-stars and some gold gloves on his mantle that he doesn't have, playing shortstop for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, if you're wondering why guys like that get the contracts they do, it's because it's really tough to be a major league gold glove caliber shortstop. We talk about all these prospects year after year and how they're all shortstop prospects. And then it feels like, Joe, they get to the upper levels of the minors and it's like, you know what? I'd like him a lot better if he kicked over to second base, or I'd like him a lot better if at 6'3" he played third base instead. So it's a very particular type of athlete that could stick it short at the next level. But you hit on something that I think is such an important point. These guys, it's their comfort zone, right? They're the best player everywhere they go throughout their childhood, so they're always the shortstop. I don't think you want them adjusting to a pro organization and also switching where they play in the fields right out of the gate. It's just talk
No.
about acclimation periods, transitions, things like that. And I think, Joe, it just keeps a more cleaner mindset for them when they're hitting, when they're not also thinking about the next half inning, all the new adjustments they have to make out in the field.
No question. And that's the biggest thing, Connor, is you want them to just adjust to professional pitching. Because even if you played in the SEC, even if you played the top levels of high school baseball, professional baseball is just a different animal and a different beast all in itself. So let's just let you come in at the position you're most comfortable with. And as you said, as we progress and you get to the upper levels of the minors where it's all kind of making sense to you, then you could take that player and say, all right, we're going to give you some looks at second base. We're going to give you some looks at third or some looks in center. And that's the way to keep as many of the good athletes as you can on the field.
All right, we got a 5-star review question. Thank you to Green Machine 82. If Pete Alonso and the Mets can't ultimately come to an agreement, which I hope is not the case, and Mark Vientos moves across the diamond, could you see a world where Jeff McNeil gets another shot to man the hot corner like a few years back, thus enabling a younger, more athletic Luis Angel Acuna to hold down second base? Or do you see more value in McNeil garnering most of the playing time at second base while also utilizing his versatility and ability to adequately play the corner outfield positions and in turn give guys like Brandon Nimmo, who is still recovering from a plantar fasciitis, a break from playing the field at times? Personally, I think the McNeil experiment at third shouldn't be revisited, but was curious about your thoughts. I agree there, Joe. I think they have internally moved on from the idea of McNeil at third, unless it was a real emergency, like 3 different injuries happened and you're just trying to get the best bats in the lineup. I think, Joe, for the foreseeable future, McNeil is a second baseman, corner outfielder, and it's kind of as simple as that.
I don't think Jeff McNeil was particularly comfortable at third base. I just don't think it really fit. And he was on foul territory. I always confuse the two shows, but he was on one of those shows and he said that he's expecting to play second base. And he's
Okay.
obviously open to playing the corner outfield spots. So for me, I think having McNeil man second base and, as the question said, fill in for Brandon Nimmo and left, Maybe you give Juan Soto a day off here and there, and McNeil could play right. I think that's where you utilize his versatility best. And if things don't work out, then of course you find your way to opportunity for Luis Angel Acuna or Ronnie Mauricio. And if Pete Alonso's gone, opportunity for Brett Beatty at third base, where that's kind of a natural spot for him.
Yeah, and the question kind of hinted at this. I think what a lot of people have to remember is the Mets corner outfielders, as great as they are, and Soto and Nimmo, you'd like to get them off their feet at times. And you're not going to be running Marte into the ground at his age. It's going to open up a lot of opportunity for McNeil as a rotational player. So, or like we said, the everyday second baseman, whatever it may be. So, I think it is one of those things. And Soto, who the Mets just gave $800 million to, he's going to be in the lineup at DH in those situations
Right.
as well. So that takes, just because Soto's getting off his feet for a day doesn't mean he's out of the lineup. And then Nimmo with the plantar fasciitis, which can definitely be an injury that you want to be careful in terms of usage. And this is where you feel good about the Mets, all the money they've dumped into sports science and projections and kind of trying to feel out, risk of injury if you do this or that. They're running models and simulations on any player with a previous history of a certain kind of injury. And them not moving McNeil, I mean, maybe the market wasn't crazy this year for him, but Joe, the fact that Marte's still on this team, McNeil's on this team, they didn't give those guys away, kind of tells you that the Mets look at their roster and go, you know what, we'd prefer to have the depth and everybody's going to play.
You want to be as deep as possible. And what I
You're the
will say
Dodgers.
is, right, that ultimately, whenever somebody needs a day off, you don't want to be putting somebody in a lineup where it's kind of like, maybe if we're lucky, they get a hit. Like you want
Right.
genuine major leaguers on your bench. And one thing about Brandon Nimmo and the plantar fasciitis, I just want everyone to be prepared and ready. Brandon Nimmo did say at Amazing Day that he expects that he thinks he'll be good for opening day, but spring training is going to take a slow roll into it. So when we are broadcasting the first game, Brandon Nimmo very well won't be in the lineup that day. Doesn't mean something's necessarily wrong, but they're going to slow roll this, as you said, due to the advice from the sports science team and the medical staff to make sure, because what matters ultimately is that Brandon Nimmo is ready to go when the lights are on for opening day and real baseball started. So don't be alarmed if Nimmo is a little behind, I guess, as spring training begins.
Our next question from YouTube from Zach W2889. What would it take to get Dylan Cease from San Diego? Joe, there's a lot of talk around Michael King, Cease, with the Padres having a lot of financial aspects of their organization up in the air right now. What do you think a package would look like for a pitcher of Cease's caliber?
It's really tough. And I don't feel like the Padres are going to trade either of these guys. I think it's one of those things that they are out there. And if somebody wants to come in and bowl them over with an offer, then they'll consider it. AJ Preller is always willing to trade guys with 1 year of control left on them. Historically, what the Padres have done, the Juan Soto trade is one of the examples, but they're not rebuilding. Like the Padres aren't going to be wanting, guys in single A, guys in double
Right.
A. They want pieces to impact now, even if that means the ceiling of that player is a little less. But when you're talking about Dylan Cease, who could be a true top of the rotation guy, if I'm them, I'm not doing a deal without Brandon Sproat in it. I don't know why I
Right.
would. And, you could look at Tyler McGill. Maybe that's someone that interests them that could come back and be a part of a rotation. Because as I said, they're not looking to tear this thing up. They would just be trying to get some value on a guy that may not stay long term. If I'm them, I'm not doing a deal without somebody like Sproat in it. And McGill makes sense. And maybe you could deal from your newfound bullpen depth, and then you tack on like a prospect or so at the end. And that to me feels like what they may seek. And I'd be stunned if David Stearns were particularly interested in doing that.
Yeah, I mean, Cease is the ultimate, like, selling high kind of guy. I mean, I
Yeah.
think they'd have to be blown away. I mean, you're talking about somebody that for 4 straight seasons, he's made 32 or more starts. I mean, he's coming off a season where he had a 3.47 ERA 2 years ago with Chicago. 2.2 ERA. I mean, WAR of 6.4 that year, wins above replacement 4.2 this year. This is a guy that, at 28, and he just turned 29 in December. It would be peak selling high, Joe. I'm with you that I think the Padres case would be, how do we get a top pitching prospect like a Sproat, and how do we get a major league piece right now where there's a world that, like they did with Soto, right? You're trying to get a little bit of volume over one high-end player so you could round out your roster a little bit. And Michael, it's ironic that Michael King's name is being thrown around there because he was one of the big pieces in the Soto trade. But, organizations like San Diego that, to be fair to them, and it was a different era, they did spend a lot of money. But guys like Preller, they get really, really creative, Joe, on how to kind of, it's not manipulate, but play to the strengths of how the financials work in baseball in terms of team control before a guy can ever hit free agency.
The AJ Preller likes to ride players until the last year and then get out. If they're not ready to extend, like maybe they look at Dylan Cease and say, we really like him, but where we are, especially with everything going on behind the scenes in San Diego, it's a little cluttered right now, that they say, we can move someone like a Dylan Cease and get, as you said, a young pitching prospect, and then somebody to just go in the rotation who may not be as good, but it's a fill-in spot for now.
All right, our last question of the day before we get to the big announcement of who won the Cadillac Club tickets, so do not go anywhere. This is from Nolan Rich. Thoughts on the new uniforms, and if the Mets could bring back any uniform, what would you choose? Joe, I like the new uniform a lot. I think my take is, because we haven't gotten confirmation on this, because they have to lose a uniform to bring in a uniform, for everybody that's not aware of that. I really like these uniforms if they depart with the blue alternate home uniform, because I just don't think you need another blue uniform, and I wouldn't want to remove any other uniform in the Mets. So the new uniform is a blue V-neck, old vintage kind of writing on it.
1987 specifically.
Yes, the 87 font. And I don't want to lose the road grays. I would like having the road gray and the road alternate blue and getting rid of the home alternate blue. But Joe, I'm a big fan. Number one, I'm a big fan of the pullover jersey more than the button down, and I think it's nice to have a balance. But I just think the orange and blue, like shades of this uniform, they looked really, really good. The players were wearing them at Amazing Day, and it's one of those things. Uniforms are weird because I think there could be a totally different perspective when a guy's wearing them versus when they're just revealed. And I thought they looked really good as like Lindor in it. We got to see Lindor in it. It's a good look, the V-neck and the font. And I like the balance of old school and new school with this uniform.
It's as if we're good friends who have been podcasting together for so long, because that's really a lot of that was what I was going to say is when I saw a picture of it when I was on my way to Citi Field for Amazing Day, just hanging up in a hanger in the locker, my initial response was, it's okay.
Right, I agree.
Fine. And then when we were there and they had the panel and they had Marte and Lindor, everyone on they looked great on the players. So I'm a fan. I think it could have stood to have maybe some gray or something in there to make the letters pop a little more. And this is a similar criticism that I think we had to the new black jerseys that came back, that if they had the white piping around, I think that just helps visually to be able to tell the name on the jersey. Like, I think it'll be a little hard to see that. And I think that's maybe like a slight factor, but all in all, I like the different look. I like the fact that it is a pullover. I like the shout out to the 87 font. So it's not just taking the New York font. Like, you remember the other blue road alternate ones that had the New York font just like the grays, but they had like gray inside. Like,
I did not like those.
I don't need a blue version of the gray road jerseys. So having something different, I think, is pretty cool. A good touch by the Mets. And my favorite part about the jersey, I saw the back of it, and the names are big. So that's the biggest thing of it all.
What uniform would you bring back? And we could do this as a I think I would like to answer this question as they wear it, 5 times throughout the season. I'm not
Yeah.
saying bring back uniform to be part of the full-time kit ensemble because I love the Mets array of uniforms that are locked in.
Yeah, I think so. I'll tell you, can we just get the white piping back on the black jerseys? That would be
I mean,
number
that's the
one.
easiest fix
That's
ever.
the easiest one. When we get into 2026, I mean, how many games are they going to do in the 1986 home race stripe jerseys? They're going to do plenty of games in those. So I think I'm excited for 2026 because that'll be what is that 40 years, I think, from 86, 96. Yeah, 40 years. I think they're going to be pulling out a lot of that. But otherwise, one thing about the Mets is they've largely had the same type of uniforms. They've always mixed in some, like, I didn't like anything orange. I wasn't into like the orange Los
Yeah,
Mets jerseys. I didn't like the home without the pinstripes when they kind of went with that
I agree. The
cream
solid white.
cream the cream
Yeah,
almost color too.
yeah.
That didn't have the pinstripes. Like that wasn't for me. But when I just think about what I would like back, bring the piping back on the black jerseys and the 86 home pinstripe jerseys.
What are our thoughts on the Mercury Mets sleeveless uniforms?
I mean, what's funny is back then.
I think you got to lean into it.
What's funny is back in the day when they did that, it was like this is the future of baseball. They acted like we were going to space or something. But the Mercury Mets was unique. Luke Voigt would be required to be signed just for a one-day contract to come and have the guns poking out of the Mercury Mets sleeveless jersey. I guess if you want to do a gimmick day, I'm fine with it, but I wasn't particularly into them.
I think they might be doing a promo with a callback to the Mercury Mets. I have to look, or did they do that?
I think they did that this past year.
They did the promo.
I think, what'd they give, a Piazza jersey, I think, or something like that?
The Piazza jersey. They did the Piazza jersey promo of it. It was, it's a funny callback. I'll say one uniform, too, that I think has aged well. And I wouldn't want it to replace the grays they have now because I really like the grays they have now. I like the 88 gray jerseys that were a V-neck pullover. They said New York on the front of them and had the blue and orange piping all the way down the sides. Like, if you want to see what I'm talking about, Google Mookie Wilson in 1988 because there's some really good pictures of him in it. I think that uniform's aged really, really well. I'd like to see the Mets wear that for a game or two this year as a throwback because the 86 uniforms are awesome, but we've seen it so many different times. Right. Like, I like to kind of look at the ones that really get overlooked in all of it. But yeah, I think overall, Joe, I thought the new uniforms look really, really good. I'm a big fan.
Agreed. And they have a good set now. If it is what we believe, which is the road has the grays and these new alternates, home has the whites, the blacks, and the city connects, I think the Mets are in a pretty good spot when it comes to uniforms.
All right, what you all been waiting for here, the Cadillac Club ticket giveaway. Before we get out of here, this is the moment we have promised. Reveal the winning member of the Mets Pod audience at Amazing Day at Citi Field. If you were there, you got to sign up. You can claim 2 tickets to the Cadillac Club and a parking pass. This is for the Mets game on Thursday, April 17th versus the Cardinals. Cadillac Club's awesome. You'll eat well. There's plenty to eat, drink, views, everything.
You will talk to Juan Soto. You will talk to Juan Soto.
Probably talk to Juan Soto, who will be 10 feet away from you.
Yeah.
And hopefully nobody hits a ball over his head where he'll be 1 foot away from you. So the winner is Seth Kleinrock. Congratulations, Seth. SNY will be in touch with you with information on how to claim your tickets. Thank you for coming to the Mets Pod at Amazing Day at the Auditorium. We had such a good time with everybody. And of course, this is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. Remember to subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your shows. Leave us a review with a question, and we'll look for it for our future mailbag segments. Of course, you can watch the show on SNY's YouTube channel. Become a subscriber over there as well. And stick with us the next couple weeks for more announcements on Joe and I down at spring training for some more Mets Pod fun. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.